Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello.
So friends, we have another show for you today, and this broadcast is brought to you by thegardenersworkshop.com, where you can learn more about all the work that we're doing over there, where we can educate you and equip you to grow great cut flowers. So what is it today, Layne? What are we chatting about?
So today we're going to talk about 3 seeds that we commonly hear people struggling with. And there are more than this too, so don't feel bad if you're struggling with a seed that's not on this list. But the 3 we're going to talk about today are Rudbeckia or black-eyed Susan, bells of Ireland, and poppies. And we're just going to try to give you some tips and tricks or try to troubleshoot what might be going wrong for you there, specifically in terms of getting these seeds to germinate.
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so the first seed we're going to talk about that we tend to hear people struggling with is black-eyed Susans or Rudbeckias. And we have some beautiful pictures. If you're joining us over on YouTube, we have Sahara on the left, a conglomerate of a bunch of different varieties in the center, and then Cherokee Sunset on the right.
They're gorgeous.
They really are. And we're talking today about Rudbeckia hirta. And actually, before we start talking about any of these seeds, I also just want to add, go back and listen to our Cool Flowers Fall Planting Checklist, which was episode 49, because we talked about how putting your cool flower seeds in the freezer for a couple of weeks prior to sowing is a really good tip that applies actually to all of the ones we're going to be talking about today. And we talked about some important considerations in terms of using desiccant packs when you're freezing seeds. So go back and listen to that. We're not going to walk through the entire seed freezing protocol using desiccants today, but it is important to make sure you're doing it properly, because otherwise you could inadvertently end up damaging your seeds when you go to put them in the freezer. So make sure to go back to episode 49 and listen to how to properly freeze your seeds. Okay, so back to Rudbeckia seeds.
Right.
Rudbeckias are a small seed. They're not as tiny as some other things, but Rudbeckias are ones that we actually recommend transplanting, starting indoors and transplanting out rather than direct seeding them outdoors. They're one that your seed pack will probably instruct you to either not cover, to just sow on the surface, or to cover only very lightly. And they typically take around 7 to 14 days to germinate. What do you think is going wrong with people's Rudbeckia seeds?
Well, I can speak to this from firsthand experience. And we just went through it. So, and it was for Cherokee Sunset. So we're sowing from the same package of seeds, and the first sowing did not germinate. And I know that it was temperature related. It was just too warm where they were, and they stayed on the heat mat. I just don't, whether the seeds got toasted or not, but they did not germinate. We have resown the seeds, the very same pack, followed pretty much the same steps, except that, we moved them off the seedling heat mat immediately when we first saw signs of life, and they're now germinating. So sometimes there's just a struggle, and I feel like air temperature really has so much more impact than I gave it, credit for.
Yes. So do you think warm temperatures could be causing a lot of people's struggles with these?
Yes, because I know that for us, I'm really fortunate that I can't start warm season and cool season seeds at the same time in my grow room, because I change up my air temperature in that room, and we do that by whether the door is opened or closed. If it's open, it's much, much cooler in there. If it's closed, it gets really warm during the day. All it takes is that door to be closed during the cool season seed starting time for somebody to come by and close it, and me not to notice it, and it just gets up to 80 or 90 degrees in there. And that can really have a great, especially if they're on a seedling heat mat, then that really accentuates the heat and cooks them. So yes, I think temperature plays a very significant role. And, you're looking for 65 to 70 degree air temperature for cool season hardy annuals being used on a seedling heat mat that the thermostat is built into the heat mats, meaning you don't have a separate thermostat. And that works really well.
Right. And we recommend raising those trays up on a cooling rack on the heat mat just to give a little airspace so it's not getting the full dose of heat whenever you're starting your cool season hardy annuals.
Yeah.
And we always say when you're sowing smaller seeds, even if you are just surface sowing them, to still make sure you're firmly seeding those seeds
Yes.
into the surface of the soil. Because sometimes I think with those people think they're just going to drop them onto the surface and they're not actually making good seed to soil contact. Right. And they're not able to absorb and imbibe the water that they need to get that germination process going and to complete successfully. And then another thing is, I think when people see the instruction, light aids in germination or seed needs light to germinate, which you will sometimes see on Rudbeckia packs, people sometimes will seed it and they'll put it on a heat mat and then also turn their lights on, especially if you're in a home garden setting and you might have heat mats in the same location as your grow lights. And if you have lights that give off some heat, they're then getting warmed from the bottom, and then these hot lights potentially are adding even more heat and drying them out from the top. And that can actually be a problem as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. So they're basically getting cooked.
Right.
Yeah. So they need cool air, warm soil, and moisture is
Right.
basically the recipe for success.
Yeah. And remember that even if a seed does need light to germinate, typically the ambient light in a room is enough to meet that requirement. I happen to have LED grow lights that give off very little heat. So for me, I could actually turn my grow lights on while the seeds are also on the heat mat and I wouldn't have any ill effects. But just keep in mind, if your grow lights do give off some heat, that is something to be aware of because you might be overheating your seeds as well as drying out that soil surface.
Right.
Have you noticed any varieties of Rudbeckia that seem to be stronger germinators or weaker germinators just in general?
Yes, that's a good question. I have found that Denver Daisy is the quickest and the strongest germinator. Although, and then, I mean, like this year, I think we have 8 different, and they just started Chimchimney today.
Ooh.
Yeah, I think we have 9, including that. So of the 8 that we started, Cherokee Sunset, the first time did not germinate. And we've restarted that. All of the trays are fairly full, but I also find, and this definitely relates to how the seed, I believe, is seeded on the surface.
Right.
I have a variation of when they actually germinate, all on the same tray, all obviously getting the same pretty much, treatment and conditions. But it's got to be the depth of the seed. And in fact, I think Rudbeckia seeds can go either way. I think that they can have light or darkness. And so if you're really having trouble and you're sowing them on the surface, I say sow them deeper, push them deeper into the soil block and see if that doesn't help you. Because perhaps they're just getting dried out on the surface in your conditions.
Right. And that's a good point. It's really important to use something to help retain moisture at that soil surface. So Lisa likes to use wide weave burlap. I tend to cover my Rudbeckia seeds that I sow in soil blocks. I cover them with a fine layer of vermiculite. Whatever works for you to just help retain some moisture at the soil surface so those seeds don't dry out at all during the germination process.
Yes.
Okay, so let's just do a quick recap of our Rudbeckia tips. Remember to pop those seeds in the freezer for a couple of weeks prior to sowing, using the proper procedures and protocols involving desiccants. Make sure that you're not just sprinkling the seeds onto the soil surface. Make sure they're actually firmly seated and making good contact with the soil, and that you're covering them with something like wide weave burlap, or like I mentioned, I use vermiculite to help retain moisture. Make sure the trays are raised up off of the heat mat if you have a room that's in the 65 to 70 range. If it's much warmer than that, you might need to consider eliminating the heat mat if you're having problems. Or if it's much cooler than that, if it's a different time of year, you might need to put them directly on the heat mat to try to get them some extra warmth.
Right.
And then remember the tip we said about if you have grow lights that give off some heat, you might not want to turn those lights on until after the seeds have actually germinated and your heat mat is off, because that can be adding some extra heat that is causing these to not want to come out and say hello.
Right.
All right, now we're going to move on to a seed that we recommend sowing directly outdoors, and that is going to be the very beautiful Bells of Ireland. So Bells of Ireland are a seed that do not want to be covered, even though they are a little bit of a larger seed. We've mentioned before, they look like tiny little rocks, and they can take a little while to germinate. They can take 14 to 21 days. And this is one where there are definitely some tricks for potentially getting better germination out of them, right?
Yeah, I have just learned that storing them in the freezer, we get our stock in and we just follow those steps that we recommend for storing seeds and getting them in the freezer. And for a couple of weeks, I mean, it's basically kind of like priming the seed, basically, right?
Right.
And so we put them in the freezer for a couple of weeks and then we pull them out and follow the storage recommendations of allowing them to defrost with the desiccant in the airtight container before we open it. And then we soak the seeds because it's like a little pebble. They're hard as a rock.
It
And
is. Yeah.
I think the real reason, two reasons that people have trouble with bells of Ireland germinating. First off, think about an egg, right? How hard a shell is on an egg. That's kind of how the shell on a seed is. Well, the shell on a bells of Ireland is like a double egg shell. It is just really thick. For that to soften up, for that little teeny sprout to push out of the center, you have to it has to really be kept moist. That is, I believe, the number one reason people don't get bells to germinate, because they just aren't, that shell never gets hydrated completely. So soaking the seed, I mean, I have soaked them for days before. Some people say that can't possibly be right, but I've done it and we get excellent germination. And so now, because we just aren't very good about knowing what we're going to plant so far in advance, literally, if I say today we're going to plant bells of Ireland, Bobo immediately goes inside and dumps the seeds into a cup of water, and I just plant them last. But that really helps them to germinate. And then the other part of the problem is you look at it and think for sure it needs to be covered with soil, just because it's
Right. It's bigger.
like a zinnia or a sunflower, it's a big seed. You just feel like they need to be covered, but in fact, they do not.
Yeah. When you soak them, like you mentioned, sometimes you've soaked them for days. Did you happen to notice if you got faster germination on those?
No, but I did grow mold and they
Oh,
still germinated.
well,
People, we just don't understand how much living stuff is in our water. Even city treated water. We have some of the best water in the country here in Hampton Roads, quality of water, city water. And even with that, you grow stuff. So, and I can remember, I mean, it was a lot of bells of Ireland. I think it was like 40,000 seeds, because that's back when we were in high production, which explains why it didn't get done on time. And it had mold. And I said, just scoop that mold floating off the top and let's go plant those babies. And we had great years. But, it may be true that it might actually germinate quicker, but I have never done that test, Layne.
and how do you make sure with a surface sown seed when you're direct seeding outdoors, how do you make sure you have good seed to soil contact, aside from just having your bed prepared in a way where the soil is ready to accept that seed? How do you make sure it's pressed in firmly?
It's really easy because I plant into that trough, that you can pull with your finger. I typically do it with our stand-up garden hoe. I wouldn't even dream of direct seeding without our trapezoid garden hoe, which you can find on our website, thegardenersworkshop.com. You stand straight up, people. There is no bending over. It is super simple. So I use that hoe. I use the point of the corner to draw a trough all the way down the bed, down the center, and then the two adjoining rows spaced out evenly next to that. Then I drop my seeds into the bottom of that trough appropriately, doing one full row at a time. Then I take that hoe and literally just walk down the row, with the blade flat in the trough long ways, and just patting as I go down. And it's just kind of firmly seeding the seeds.
Right.
And it just kind of seats them in there so that they're not really covered with soil, but yet they're seeded, and then they're ready to be watered. And it works. I mean, I have such excellent germination on bells of Ireland now that I can't ever believe I struggled, but we definitely follow some steps to get that.
Yes. So do the freezer trick for a couple of weeks prior to planting, following the protocol with the desiccant that we've outlined before. Then soak the seeds in water for at least a few hours, would you say, Lisa? How long can you soak them for? In your Cool Flowers book, it actually says up to 5 days.
That's what we've done, yeah. But the mold growing actually happened, right, I think, on day 6 or day 7. But yeah, I mean, they are very hard little rocks.
Yes.
So yeah, it really helped us.
So soak the seeds for at least a few hours. Make sure you don't cover the seeds when you actually go out there and sow them. and then make sure you firm them down so they are firmly seated into that soil, making good contact. Be sure to water that bed in and make sure you keep it moist throughout the entire germination process. And as always with direct seeded things, make sure you sow thicker than you need so that you have more than enough plants to choose from.
And one other little tip, Layne. So especially if you're doing a lot of seeds like we do as farmers, I just soak them in a bowl, and then I have the type of colander that has metal screens, so it's really tiny little spaces. I just dump them in there. And another great use, because we also use commercial coffee pots here. Between us, our large family gatherings and church, we have those big commercial coffee pots. They have those great metal filters in the top where you put the coffee grounds, they also work really well. That's actually what I used first for several years to just dump my seeds into, to drain them, to take them out to the garden to plant them.
Good tip. All right, now we're going to move on to one that gives people a lot of troubles, which is sad because these are such pretty flowers, and it's poppies. And on the screen over on YouTube, I have Iceland poppies, but this also applies if you're growing the giant poppy pods that we've covered a lot of times in other episodes. And poppies are another one that we recommend sowing directly outdoors in the garden. So poppies are very, very tiny, almost dust-like seeds. If you think of the poppy seeds on a bagel, you can imagine the size of seeds we're talking about here. So they do not want to be covered. They want to be surface sown. They can take 7 to 21 days to germinate. What do you think is going wrong in terms of poppy seed germination?
Temperature, or they're covering the seed. And so I've heard all kinds of different ways to sow tiny seeds. And I frankly feel the best way to do it is you must do it at the right time for that particular seed, meaning temperature wise. But I prefer to just do it on a day that has no wind, still conditions outside, and to dump about 25 to 50 seeds in the palm of my hand. And literally, I pick up the seeds with my thumb and index finger, and you don't pick up a bunch at one time. I just pick up a few, and then I just rub my fingers back and forth to actually move it. So you're dropping one or so every inch. And again, they do not get covered. And it does a really, really good job. The two really key pieces is to do it at the right time. Remember their name, Iceland poppies. They really want it cooler than warmer. So if you're still having 85-degree days, then they're not going to germinate. It just stops all their work. They go dormant, right? And the other thing is, and then they need to be sown on the surface and seeded firmly into the soil, but they need some light and oxygen to actually germinate.
Do you do anything different with your troughs for really tiny seeds like this?
No, but I just am really careful to be sure. I try to get them on the bottom in the V, and then again, we'll take my hoe, the garden stand-up hoe, and with the blade long ways, and just walk down and just pat and make a little flat spot in the bottom of the trough. And that just ensures that the seed makes good contact.
And with tiny seeds like this, it is really important, as we've mentioned before, make sure you're not out there trying to sow them on a windy day, or even if wind is expected in the next few days. That's very important. Or if you're expecting a storm with extremely heavy rains that can displace the seeds. Again, make sure you're not walking on your beds. That can end up covering some of these seeds that don't want to be covered. And then when you're going to water to keep your beds moist, don't flood that bed. Just get it moist, because you really could wash the seeds away or end up, like I said, burying them when they actually need and want to be on the surface.
And that's a good point, Layne. So if planting in the troughs really allows you, for instance, to use row cover when it's cool enough, especially when you're going to have a windstorm. That is one way to really help protect your seeds that are sown on the surface. But I can't emphasize enough just remember their name. They're Iceland poppies. So you're better to sow them later than earlier. And I will confess that I even sow Iceland poppies thicker than I do other seeds. And the picture you're looking at on the left here, I leave the clusters together. We literally do not thin Iceland poppies. And they are you cannot believe how productive they are. When they are planted at the proper timing in the fall, or very early spring if you're, in really cold zones, 3 or 4 perhaps. When they get established, when it's cold outside and are really ready to hit the ground, I mean, we get hundreds and hundreds of blooms off of a very small sowing of Iceland poppies.
So do you still sow these Iceland poppies at the same temperatures, the same timing that you direct seed all your other cool flowers, or do you wait even longer for poppies since they're so sensitive to heat?
We try, I mean, I typically do them all at the same time, but I really look at the next 2 weeks forecast and I just hold off direct sowing. If we're going to have, like we had last week, we had a run of 90-degree days. I'm just so grateful that it wasn't time for me literally yet to direct sow. But if I saw that and it's the week that I thought I was going to be direct sowing, you can count on that I'd wait.
Yeah. So check the weather, make sure it's not too warm, make sure you're not covering the seeds. Remember, they can take up to 21 days to germinate, so they can take a little while to germinate. That's another component there. And then make sure they have good seed to soil contact, that they're not getting blown away or washed away. Keep those seeds moist during the entire germination process, and perhaps sow more seed than you would for other things because they have more occurrences of just the seed getting displaced on account of the fact that it's so tiny.
Yeah. And then again, we just don't really thin Iceland poppies. So you'll benefit from that.
Oh, yes, you will. Okay, well, that was it for this episode of Seed Talk. I hope that helped some of you that might have been struggling with some of these seeds. If there are any other flowers that you're struggling to get to germinate, let us know if you'd like us to cover them on a future episode. We always love when you like and comment over on YouTube, and that's a great way for me to connect with everyone out there that's listening. And also, we love and appreciate so much when you leave ratings and reviews in a podcast app. And just remember to subscribe or follow wherever you're watching or listening so that you won't miss any of our future episodes.
Yes, friends. And so we just invite you to check out thegardenersworkshop.com, where you can find home base for everything that we're doing, all the work there, learn more. So friends, until we meet again here on Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne, ciao.
Bye.